Picture a company doing $5 billion a year in sales. Brakes, filters, wipers, parts sitting on shelves in almost every auto parts store in America. Now picture that same company filing for bankruptcy with $9 billion in debt and $12 million in the bank. Not $9 million, not $90 million, $12 million against $9 billion in liabilities. Within 4 months, the founder and his brother were in handcuffs. Federal prosecutors say the whole thing was, in their words, a Ponzi scheme. This is the story of First Brands. Patrick James was born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and raised and educated in Ohio. Over 3 decades, he built one of the most recognizable names in the auto parts industry, and almost nobody outside the industry had ever heard of him. In 2013, he started a company called Crown Group. By 2020, it had a new name, First Brands Group, and the name fit, because First Brands didn't build products from scratch, it bought them. One acquisition after another, it swallowed up brands that were already sitting in American garages and glove compartments. Fram oil filters, Raybestos brakes, Autolite spark plugs, Trico and Anco wiper blades. First Brands even held the license to put the Michelin name on wipers. Cardone remanufactured parts, Carter, Airtex, Lubrifiner, PetroClear. Towing brands like Draw-Tite, Reese, and Takancha. Even the LED lighting division that used to belong to Philips. If you've bought auto parts in the last few years, there's a good chance money went to First Brands, whether you knew the name or not. To Wall Street, this looked like a growth story, an aggressive roll-up strategy turning a fragmented industry into a single, valuable empire. Lenders lined up to finance the next acquisition, and the next, and the next. But underneath the growth story was a different machine, and prosecutors say Patrick James built that machine on purpose. Here's how factoring is supposed to work. A company like First Brands sells parts to a customer and sends an invoice. Instead of waiting 30, 60, 90 days to get paid, First Brands sells that invoice to a financing company, a factor, for most of its value up front. The factor collects from the customer later and keeps the difference as its fee. It's a completely normal way for a big manufacturer to manage cash flow. Thousands of legitimate companies do it every day. Here's what prosecutors say First Brands did instead. Under the direction of Patrick James and his brother Edward James, employees allegedly created invoices for sales that never happened. Products that were never shipped to customers who never ordered them, on paper at least. In other cases, real invoices were inflated. The dollar amount quietly increased to make them worth more than the actual transaction. And in some cases, the exact same invoice, the exact same promised payment, was sold or pledged to more than one lender at the same time. One invoice, 2 lenders, sometimes 3. Imagine selling the same car to 3 different buyers, collecting a down payment from each one, and hoping none of them ever compare notes. That's effectively what prosecutors allege happened here. Billions of dollars at a time. The invoice fraud wasn't the only mechanism. There was a second layer, and it's more complicated, so let's walk through it slowly. Patrick James controlled a set of separate companies. Prosecutors call them the James entities. On paper, they looked independent from First Brands. In reality, according to the indictment, they had no operations of their own at all. They existed for one purpose. Here's what that purpose was. The James entities borrowed money from outside lenders. Prosecutors call them the off-sheet lenders, specifically to buy inventory from First Brands. So far, that sounds like an ordinary transaction. But then those same James entities pledged that same inventory right back to the off-sheet lenders as collateral for the loan that bought it in the first place. And critically, First Brand's senior lenders, the banks financing the company directly, were never told any of this was happening. This entire layer of debt sat outside the corporate balance sheet they were shown. It was invisible to them. It gets more deliberate than that. To make the money trail even harder to follow, Patrick James allegedly routed the loan proceeds from the off-sheet lenders through a separate collections entity, one that sat outside First Brand's official corporate structure. From there, the money moved into First Brand's subsidiaries and finally swept into First Brand's main operating account. By the time that cash landed in the account First Brands actually used to run the business, it looked like ordinary customer payments from retail subsidiaries. Not loan proceeds, not debt, just regular revenue coming in the door. That's not an accident of complicated corporate structuring. Prosecutors say that flow of funds was deliberately designed to disguise borrowed money as sales revenue. There was a third mechanism, and this one shows up in the company's own internal paperwork. First Brands also factored its accounts payable, money it owed to its own suppliers. Normally, a factor pays the supplier on First Brands' behalf and collects from First Brands later. But prosecutors say First Brands submitted false and misleading information to push those factors into advancing more money than they should have, and then diverted a portion of that extra money back to itself to cover its own cash needs. Inside the company, employees had a name for this. They called it a round trip, or, when they wanted it to sound more official, a corporate initiative. And Patrick James and Edward James didn't just tolerate this. Prosecutors say they personally monitored and managed these round-trip transactions as part of the company's daily cash management. Then there's the paper trail that makes the intent hard to dispute. At First Brands, employees allegedly maintained something internally called bridge files. These files laid the company's real, accurate financial numbers side by side with the manipulated version, the version that got sent to lenders. Two sets of books, one for reality, one for the banks. That's the picture prosecutors have built. Fake invoices sold to factors, a shell network hiding billions in debt off the balance sheet, and cash secretly rerouted back into the company, all to keep the growth story alive for lenders who had no idea what they were actually financing. For years, the machine held together. New financing paid off old financing. New acquisitions kept the growth story believable. But by early 2025, the cracks started to show. In the spring, First Brands began missing lease payments, a small, quiet warning sign. By August, the company needed to refinance its mounting debt. But this time, lenders wanted real answers. They demanded deeper due diligence, and what they found was a mountain of risky, expensive working capital financing that hadn't been fully disclosed before. The refinancing deal fell apart. On September 9, 2025, a lender called Onset Financial owed close to $1.9 billion on an inventory financing deal, declared First Brands in default, and demanded the entire balance, all at once. There was nowhere left to go. On September 24th and 28th, First Brands and dozens of its affiliated companies filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing more than $9 billion in total obligations. A court-appointed examiner was brought in, backed by a $7 million budget, to dig through exactly what had happened. The finding: allegations of factoring fraud tied to more than $2.3 billion in losses. 1,267 employees lost their jobs as the company was broken apart. Patrick James resigned. First Brands itself turned around and sued him, accusing him of what its own filing called grievous misconduct. And within weeks, the Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. On January 26, 2026, an executive named Peter Broombergs quietly pled guilty in Manhattan federal court. He's now cooperating with prosecutors. 3 days later, on January 29th, it became public why that mattered. That morning, federal agents arrested Patrick James and his brother Edward James in Ohio. Prosecutors unsealed an indictment charging both of them with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and bank fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and multiple individual counts of wire fraud and bank fraud. Patrick James faces one more charge on top of that: managing a continuing financial crimes enterprise. The maximum penalty for that charge alone is life in prison. At the press conference announcing the charges, U.S. Attorney Jay Clayton put it plainly. The James brothers obtained billions for First Brands and millions for themselves by presenting their lenders with the impression of a successful, growing international business. The indictment and the guilty plea unsealed today describe a very different reality: a business run through fraud, fake documents, and false financials. An IRS criminal investigation official went even further, saying the defendants, quote, operated First Brands as a Ponzi scheme in which new loan proceeds were used to pay back old lenders and to fund their extravagant lifestyle. To be clear, these are allegations. Patrick James and Edward James have not been convicted of anything, and under the law, they are presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. But the numbers in that indictment are hard to look past. Prosecutors say that even as the fraud was unraveling, Patrick James personally received at least hundreds of millions of dollars into his own accounts. Here's where it stands today. A global auto parts empire, built brand by brand over 3 decades, collapsed into bankruptcy almost overnight. Lenders and creditors are facing losses in the billions. Over 1,000 workers lost their jobs, and the founder, who built the whole thing, now faces a charge that carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. Patrick James and Edward James have both pled not guilty. The case is ongoing, and a trial date hasn't been set. We'll be following this one as it moves through federal court. If you found this breakdown useful, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the biggest fraud cases making headlines. And let me know in the comments, do you think the banks should have caught this sooner? See you in the next one.